morning. Thank you for joining us for today's genealogy program. Today is January 10th, 2026. I am Jessica Ashton from the Royal Gorge Regional Museum and History Center, coming at you from City Hall. Just a couple quick things before we get started today. 2026 is a pretty exciting year. It is both our nation's 250-year anniversary, but also Colorado is special in that we are the centennial state. We're the only centennial state. And so we are celebrating our 150th anniversary of Colorado's statehood. And so there's all sorts of things happening this year, both on a national level, a state level, and locally. And so just keep an eye out. There's lots of ways to look at what's happening in our community with, as it pertains to these celebrations. Definitely keep an eye on the Royal Gorge Chamber Alliance. And their website, Fremont 360, and the Fremont County Tourism Council are all really good resources for where to find out what's happening. There'll be stuff happening all year, all over Fremont County. Kind of the first big event is going to be January 21st at the Royal Gorge Chamber Alliance here in Canyon City at 5 p.m. There's going to be kind of a ribbon cutting and a kickoff ceremony just to get the year started. So make sure and check that out. And then at the museum next month, February 7th, and we've got our annual Friends of the Museum annual meeting. And that's going to be combined with a program where we'll have members from the Daughters of the American Revolution there to talk about what they do and how to get involved there, as well as a program called Lineage of Liberty. And so that's at the museum. Saturday, February 7th, and you can feel free to call down to the Royal Gorge Regional Museum and History Center for more information. So with that said, I will hand it off to Terri Meeks, our presenter on today's genealogy program. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. And we're going to talk about company towns this morning. And we even have one, two, or more here locally. The picture that you see, we were going to talk about a little bit later, but it is of Pullman, Illinois, that was set up by Mr. Pullman for his elaborate train cars. So we'll see a little bit more about that in a few minutes. It's really hard to realize that maybe one of the first company towns might have been Jamestown. When the settlers came in 1607, they represented the Virginia Company of London. So Jamestown was established by this company. They were actually governed by a president and 6 council members that were appointed by the company. They used indentured servants and later slaves to do the work. And it was in 1614 when John Rolfe introduced the tobacco seed. This was a vital addition to the community. Up until this point, it was exactly failing. But once they introduced tobacco, it became the cash crop. And the Virginia Company was able to recoup their investment. So that is one of the principles of these company towns that we're going to talk about. They invested largely, but they wanted a return for their money. So let's look back really to pre-industrial times. The basic technology of water power and use of water power existed well before the Industrial Revolution. So from the mid 1600s to the late 1800s, Americans used this powerful water system, whether it be a small stream or a brook. They used that to power thousands of various kinds of mills, grist mills, sawmills, fulling mills. A fulling mill, this is something that I didn't know. It's essentially a woolen mill where they tamp down and cleanse the wool so that it becomes a much denser fiber. It becomes water resistant and it becomes more durable. Very, very similar to felting that we might do today. So most of these rural communities had at least one mill. Some of the larger communities probably had several. Here is a rebuilt 1636 Jenny grist mill. Many of these mills were established in New England. They were small, they were simple, and the owners of the mills, they essentially worked the mill by themselves. They might have had a helping hand, but usually it was a one-man operation. And they negotiated with the people, or depending on the community and its setup, they had a specific percentage of the product that they received in form of payment. These mills were always located near streams and or brooks that was going to power the wheel. And this was temporary work. They could not work during the winter season because frequently these streams froze. So it might have been a 9-month operation. The actual mill house in the country, rural areas, was usually a 1 or a 2-story wooden structure, and they usually just had one water wheel. When we get to the county level, we might see larger mills. The county usually had a sawmill, and it might have had 1 or 2 saws. The grist mills, likewise, if it was in a larger community, they might have had 2 pairs of millstones instead of just the single. And I found an interesting statistic that in the 1840 census, there were still 28,000 grist mills and 32,000 sawmills. And here we see that simple structure. We see a 2-story part of the mill and a single wheel. In Old Sturbridge Village, there is the sawmill, and we see the interior with the single saw. The mechanism to operate the saw is down below. And when we get into the more industrial age, we see the larger 2-story mills with many bands circulating the machinery. So we hit the industrial age, and everything changes once the steam engine is invented. This made these sawmills, they could operate, or the mills could operate year round. And it essentially put a lot of these small mills out of business because it led to the creation of factories. With that steam engine, they could accomplish a lot more. Also, the impact on transportation. Roads were more developed, canals were more developed. And by 1850, we have the introduction of the railroad. So it made it easier for factories and even the small mills to get their products to the destinations that they wanted. This also led to communities being built by businesses. And initially, it was textiles that came into your company towns. By the time 1850 came along, we get into coal mining and later steel and lumber. All of these industries produced company towns. So why were the towns created? From the company perspective, they would find a location and they would set up their community. And essentially, they wanted to attract workers. They wanted to have a stable workforce. The company owned everything. They owned the store, they owned the housing. So they wanted to keep the workers tied to their jobs. They also had a paternalistic attitude towards them. They thought that by providing everything for the worker owed them some allegiance. And hopefully this would reduce efforts to unionize and also to prevent strikes. It turned out that company towns were an economic engine for the local area as well as for the country, but they also were a social experiment. All of these people living in the same community, attracted by the same work opportunities, getting the same pay, having the same recreational opportunities. It was a closed area, kind of essentially. The company towns were probably mostly located in remote areas because they needed large portions of land in order to set up the housing, the factory, etc. And it also had to be located near where the natural resources. In terms of mills, it might have been water. In terms of coal, it was a location of the actual coal. So they did recruit their laborers. They wanted people to come in off the farm and earn a wage. So they actually, the company owners built cities from scratch. And as I mentioned, they had a paternalistic attitude. They wanted to introduce people to middle class values. So they had moral oversight into these communities as well. As I mentioned, these communities had significant startup costs. They had to build the factory, they had to build the housing, the company store, and practically all of the towns that I have seen have had schools at a minimum. Many of them had clubhouses, pool halls, swimming pools, and other amenities for the workers. The layout usually assembled the factory hierarchy in that the executives were located close to the town square, and the workers were usually housed in boarding houses or apartments that were nearer to the factory so they could simply walk to their jobs. And here again, they wanted to recoup their initial cost. The paternalistic attitude was that they wanted moral and even religious aspects of their employees to be to their way of thinking. They wanted to instill the middle class values, and they thought that by enforcing church attendance, that people would lead a more moral life and become more valued citizens. So the textile industry was one of the first to establish company towns. They were also one of the earliest to become mechanized. And it was because of these three main inventions that allowed the textile industry to thrive. Here we see a spinning jenny. And this reduced the work needed to produce cloth. A worker could do 8 threads at a time, use 8 spools. Later, these spinning jennies grew to be 120 spools. But before that, when we still had the 8 spools, they had the Arkwright water frame. And this was able to spin 96 threads at a time. So we're getting more industrialized. And finally, we have the spinning mule, that the carriage carried up to 1,320 spools, spindles, and they could be 100. These mules could be 150 feet long, and the carriage would move forward and back a distance of 5 feet 4 times a minute. So we're huge spinning ability at this point. So our first mill, we look to Francis Cabot Lowell. He was a Boston merchant, and in 1811, he visited the factories in England. And his point in doing this, he couldn't draw, he wasn't allowed to draw, but he wanted to memorize the technology that the British cloth mills were using and bring that technology back to the United States. You have to realize at this point, this was against the law to memorize and to bring back. It was stealing technology, but he did it, and it laid the groundwork for new textile production in Massachusetts. 2 years later, he established the Boston Manufacturing Company. And it was originally located in Waltham, Massachusetts. They were located next to a river. And the Boston Manufacturing Company was the first to combine all stages of cotton cloth production. And what that essentially means is all stages was they were spinning, weaving, dyeing, and cutting the cloth. So a complete system. They used power looms and machinery to increase their efficiency. And this became known as the Waltham system. They owned and had complete control over all aspects of the production of the cotton, and it prevented interference from competitors. So, but the Waltham mill became too small. So they looked to Lowell, Massachusetts. They established a community there. It was west of the Boston area, and they built the Boston Manufacturing Company, or actually the Boston Manufacturing Company built the town of Lowell. They needed more water power than they had in Waltham. So in 1822, they began the first large-scale planned industrial community. And it was designed around the textile industry. It was going to be powered by the Merrimack River, which is a large river. And for the textile industry, they looked to single women. They went out to the farms in the local and larger community, and they specifically enticed these single young women with salaries, independence to come and work there. The young women would be protected because they would be living in community boarding houses. There were several mills that actually contributed to the growth of Lowell, Massachusetts. They built massive 5- and 6-story brick mills along this Merrimack River. The other thing they did to get the power was to develop a system of canals. And by 1850, they had almost 6 miles of canals, which could drive water wheels for 40 mills. They powered 320,000 spindles and almost 10,000 looms. And at their height, they were employing 33,000 people, both women and men. Those young ladies that they recruited became known as Lowell girls. They did live in boarding houses supervised by strict matrons, and they had a strict moral code: no alcohol, no dancing, and church attendance was mandatory. And here we see Lowell girls in front of their brick boarding house. The multiple companies, there were 9 altogether. The companies coordinated their work hours. They relied on bells to announce the start of work, breaks, and the 10 p.m. curfew. To avoid any disputes or workers changing their loyalty from one company to another, the workers were paid the same amount, usually $12 to $14 a month, depending on their skill level, as well as what their actual job was. The mills ran 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, and the employees had 3 unpaid holidays per year. So the mills operated longer in the summer. We're still talking about the 1820s up to the 1840s. So we don't have electric light or powered light, but they did extend the day in winter by using whale oil lamps. Here is a list of the mills at the Lowell, in the Lowell town. The boot mill is among the earliest of these. And today it is you can actually visit the boot cotton mills and take a tour. The Merrimack was unique in that they made calico prints, and they pioneered in cloth printing. The Lowell manufacturing, they actually made carpets. The Lawrence manufacturer made cotton textiles originally, but then they moved on to hosiery production. And the Middlesex Company was a woolen mill. So, and eventually the Suffolk mills and the Tremont mills actually merged. So here we see the boot cotton mill, and we see that there are actually numerous buildings where the milling was going on, and we see the canal as well as some of the housing. When competition came along, it actually helped to lead to the demise of these mills. Excuse me. They were overproducing. There were 9 mills. They were working 12 hours a day. So by 1834, they had to cut the wages of the workers, and this led to work stoppages. The female workers petitioned for a 10-hour work day. So, and the Civil War came along in the 1860s. So the cotton supply was cut off from the mills. And this led to 10,000 workers losing their jobs, and the mills shut down. After the Civil War, the mills moved to the South, where labor was cheaper cotton was readily available. It didn't have to be transported. So, but the mills did continue at a much slower, leaner pace. And after World War II, all of the Lowell mills closed. The economy had changed. The rise in coal mining, steel production, and the rise in railroads. This economy was known as the industrial triad because coal was necessary to make the steel. Steel was necessary for the rails on the railroad, and the railroads were necessary for transporting coal. So we see the circular pattern. Looking at the Lowell censuses, this is from 1860, and we see at the top these young women who are weavers, and at the bottom we see them as mill hands. In 1870, this whole page, everyone is a cotton mill worker in one way, shape, or form. We do have some weavers and other contributors other than just working in a coal mill or cotton. By the 1880s, we see a little bit of difference. We see people working in the woolen mill, in the calico mill, as well as in the cotton mill. By 1900, we see people kind of living independently, but we find two young women, Nellie and Ethel, and they are working as folders, one in the textile mill, the other in a knitting mill. Here we have an 1886 city directory, and we see where the people are working in the Merrimack as well as the boot mill. And we also see that Patrick Keenan, he's working in the Appleton mill. And we also see a couple of people. We see Archibald Keith at the bottom, and he is a spinner. He's probably not living in the housing. He's living in independent housing in the town of Lowell that has grown up around the mills. In 1907, we see people that were still working in the Merrimack and the Tremont mills. We see Anne Curry. She's working in the Lawrence mill. And we see, let's see. So we find on death certificates that people are working in the cotton mills. And knowing what series of mills were operating in 1910 will help you to figure out, if this is your family, exactly which of the cotton mills your ancestor, Mr. Collins, worked in. It's important to look at the surroundings, not just find the names and births, marriage, deaths for your people. Find that additional information. Just because they might have been a spinner or something in a mill, dig deeper and find out exactly what mill they were working in. We find Mr. Desolé living in the boot cotton mill. And one thing that's interesting is this gentleman is from Canada. He's probably a French person coming from the Quebec area. So there was a great deal of immigrant work at this time. We see Mr. Bergeron, another native French descendant. He was actually born in Lowell, but he is working at the Merrimack Cotton Mill in World War II. He probably did not come home to a job in the mills. Oops. Here's a diagram of the Merrimack mills, and we see the dark lines kind of at the top is part of the canal system that they had built from the river. We see the yellow highlighted line, and that's a new set of canal features that they were building for the mill. The mill itself is frontage all along the river, and we see the layout of the streets, etc., that supported that mill. The red line is where the person that they were investigating is actually living in the community. Here's an 1833 picture of the Middlesex Mill. And at the bottom, it says the company includes 3 mills and also dye houses, and was unusual among the mills of Lowell for the fact that it manufactured cashmeres and woolens instead of cotton. The Lawrence Manufacturing Company. This is also an early drawing. And the Boot cotton mills, once they became mechanized, that steam engine came along. And this mill, as I mentioned earlier, is still in, it's still in existence, and it can be toured. Here we see the Clark sisters, and they worked at the Boot cotton mill. So you can even find pictures on either Ancestry or online. This happened to come from Ancestry. So I mentioned how with the more industrialization, we come out west and we come to Chandler. It was homesteaded by Asa Chandler in 1861, but it wasn't until 1890 that the coal mill actually got started. Rockvale, Old Creek, and Williamsburg had all been founded and were in operation as coal mining towns prior to 1890. So Chandler is fourth in line. In 1890, the Western Fuel Company opened the mine. They had spent $100,000 to sink a shaft, have rooms and tunnels, and they were in the process of sinking a second shaft for hoisting. 50 men were employed, but they would have a full capacity of 250 men. And in 1890, the town site was platted. And we actually see how they laid out the town. They had space for a good part of housing, and the larger square on the left is the plan for the school. In general, for the coal industries, mines operated in isolated regions where the coal was found. You needed that natural resource. And because they were probably in isolated areas or less developed areas, they needed to provide the housing to attract and maintain the employees, just like in the textile industry. Interestingly enough, in the 1920s, Southern Appalachia and Rocky Mountains 65 to 80% of miners lived in company towns. From the Canyon City Record in 1891, contractors' bids were sought for the furnishing of all material and constructing 30 to 40 frame houses. In 1898, the Victor Coal Company purchased the mine, and they greatly improved the power plant, provided a new cage in the shaft, had screens in the dump, and they raised the miners' wages from 70 cents per ton to $1 per ton. Notice this is not an hourly wage. This is a production wage. And it turns out that a miner could load from 1 to 3 tons a day. So they could earn $2.10 a day to $3 a day at the most. Here is a picture of Chandler. And in 1901, they were building brick houses, 40 new brick houses. The company actually made their own bricks. And the homes were laid out in the streets with rows of trees. The company backed a community beautification program offering that cash rewards. I think it was $5 for the most attractive yard. And they had a new meat market and a grocery store. By 1905, 175 men were employed. They had 36 miles of track in a maze of rooms, and they had a stable of 100 mules who hauled the ore cars. In 1920, they had a payroll of 400, producing 12,000 tons per month of coal. And the town had a population of over 600. A 2-story school was built and served as a community building where they were able to hold dances, and they had covered dish suppers. It's also interesting, Chandler had a baseball team of their own that would compete against other company towns. Dr. Alexander Warshil was the company physician, and each family of the miners contributed $1 per month, which was matched by the company, to cover their health care costs at no additional cost. Here we have a 1972 Canyon City Record looking back at history. The actual original image is from 1935, and all of the people in the image are identified in the newspaper article. So the mine simply became unprofitable. There were dwindling resources. They were tapping out the coal. And there were increased operating costs. The market conditions were changing, and the population of the town actually was dwindling. So the mine actually closed on July 5th of 1942. The buildings, the houses, were sold later for $25 per room or $50 per room if they had electricity. And if you walk or drive around Canyon City, there are several of these houses still in existence today. Here we have the Daily Record announcement that the mine is closing. And if we look at the 1900 census, over in the occupations, we see that virtually everyone is a coal miner. I believe there is one saloon keeper in the list. Interestingly enough, this is the 1920 census, and we are still seeing people all as coal miners. The 1910 and 1920 censuses both, they were 8 pages of censuses for the town of Chandler, and virtually everyone was working in the coal mine or supporting it in some way. A true company town. Here is the 1920 census that we see. And by 1930, the census was 12 pages long, and we still see people working in the coal mines. We see the city directory for Chandler, and we see miners, timbermen, miners, machine helper. We see various occupations, many in support of the mine. Postmasters for Chandler. They did receive mail in the company, or so we had to have the appointment of postmasters. We see from World War I, draft registrations. Mr. Cross is a miner and a telegrapher for the Victor American Fuel Company. We see Camillo Moschetti, and he is a miner for Victor American. And even up to World War II, we see people working for Victor American Fuel in Chandler. From 1890, the Rocky Mountain News, we get names. Ray Leake is the unanimous choice of the miners and citizens for postmaster. P.J. Morgan is conducting the new 24-room hotel and furnishes excellent accommodations to miners and the traveling public. John Kyle, an old-time mine boss of the Canyon City Coal Company, is the mine boss for the company. All valuable information. Look in those newspapers to see if your ancestor might have been named. Smith Cochran, Frank Moore, John Green, James Lynn, George Abbott, John Houston, etc., are some of the prominent men among the camp. 1902, Mr. Thompson has the contract for painting the houses in the town of Chandler. There are 53 houses all told. So it gives you an idea of what the community was like, the closed community, and the occupations, as well as the presence of the people in the community. Pullman, Illinois is another example of a company town. It was built by George Pullman for the employees of his Pullman Palace Car Company. And he purchased 4,000 acres for the town and for the factory. The housing for workers was actually separated from the industrial areas. This was kind of the Cadillac or the Pullman of company towns. They did groundbreaking in the spring of 1880. And here we see a luxury Pullman car. This happens to be J.P. Morgan's private Pullman car. It was the first all brick city. It had 1,500 buildings. It had a dozen detached houses, I'm sure, for the executives. They had multifamily row houses, 10 large apartment buildings, and water, gas, and indoor plumbing was provided for all of them. We're looking at 1880 here, and we're getting indoor plumbing. The people could not buy their houses. This was a company town. So the company charged rent that would ensure a 6% return on the company's investment. Here again, we have to pay for all of this. So workers might have paid $4.50 per month in an apartment, up to $100 per month for a house. And here we see a picture of Pullman, Illinois. They had multifamily row houses with streets in front and an alley in back for daily garbage collection. It attracted skilled workers. In 1883, it had a population of 8,000, more than half of whom were immigrants. In the 1890s, the Pullman, Illinois is very close to Chicago. So for the 1893 Chicago World's Fair, there was an excursion to Pullman, Illinois. It became a national tourist attraction. It provided churches, markets, banks, library. The library was not free. You paid a membership fee that was automatically deducted from your paycheck. The railroad industry did undergo unrest, and this also spilled into Pullman, Illinois. Residents, workers could not buy or alter their homes, so they only stayed for about 4 years, even though this was pretty much the Cadillac of homes at the time. When the wages were reduced, there was no reduction in the cost of rent or in the prices at the company store. So unrest was developing. There was the financial panic of 1893, and the railroads had become mismanaged and overbuilt. There were numerous independent railroads that were competing with one another. Factory orders declined, and there was a decrease in wages. Workers left because they were being starved out. They were getting starvation wages at this point. So in 1894, the workers went on strike. This led to a nationwide boycott. Railroads shut down most of the nation's freight and passenger traffic. And eventually it involved 250,000 workers in 27 states. Federal troops were called out to settle the strike, and there were 30 deaths and the loss of millions of dollars. And this kind of contributed to the demise of the town. Pullman himself died in 1897, so there was no supreme guardian for the community. And in 1898, the Illinois Supreme Court ordered that they sell all of the property in the county or in the town, especially the residential properties. The industrial properties were maintained by the company. By 1907, all of the housing was privately owned. So the housing stayed there, but it became the town of Pullman, Illinois, completely independent. You will notice that there are no census records for this particular period of time. They broke ground in 1880 and it met its demise by 1897. So we have the period when the census in 1890 burned. So we have no census records to show the workers in Pullman, Illinois. It is part of the National Park Service. It is a state and a national monument. And the National Park Service does have some records for the community. The Pullman porters, who were all African American, the Pullman car shops, as well as the strike. The Digital Public Library of America has a couple of documents relating to the town of Pullman. And most of the documentation refers to the construction of the homes, the architecture of the homes. The Newberry Library is the repository for Pullman documents. They have the company records. Most of them are business archive records. They do not have any truly employee records for the manufacturing part. They do have records for the porters. They don't have any records for the town employees. And they have a digital collection, but it's mostly for the Pullman car designs. And here is a look at that website, and you can see where you can choose the various Pullman car designs. Alcoa, Tennessee. In 1907, the Pittsburgh Reduction Company changed its name to the Aluminum Company of America, a true acronym, Alcoa. It wanted to establish a large smelting operation in East Tennessee. This was at the same time that the Tennessee Valley Authority was building dams. So the Little Tennessee River was a good source of hydroelectric power. They had access to the Louisville and Nashville and the Southern railroads. In 1910, they established a Bates camp at Calderwood, Tennessee. And in 1914, the company purchased 700 acres in North Maryville. They started construction of the smelting plant. In all of these, they start construction of the factory part before they start building the houses. They started building 150 houses to house the workers. They did build schools, and they assisted various denominations in the construction of their churches. They built what was called the Mule Barn. The mule was an important member of the construction organization, so they called it the Mule Barn. This building was converted to a school for the African American community. They actively recruited African Americans. And finally, it became the Alcoa, Tennessee Municipal Building. And here it is. That's the Mule Barn. I mentioned the Tennessee Valley Authority. So as part of that, in 1916, the construction of the Chiowa Dam, it was constructed by a subsidiary of Alcoa, the Tallahassee Power Company, and it would generate the electricity for the smelter. The dam was completed in 1919. during World War I, and it was the world's highest overflow dam at 225 feet. They had the largest turbines in the world, and they were producing the highest voltage over the longest span. And here is a picture of that dam. It is significantly high. The workers primarily were from Blount County. And at the time, there was a Mexican community there, and they recruited these Mexican immigrants for their labor force. They reached out to Georgia and Alabama to recruit African American labor. World War I increased the demand. So in 1919, when that dam was also completed, the rolling mill was completed and the town was incorporated as Alcoa. By 1920, they had a population of 3,300 roughly, in 700 houses. The city's welfare obviously depended on the company's fortunes. And when the Depression hit, rather than lay off the workers, they cut their hours to 30 hours per week, and they continued to make aluminum. They stockpiled 42,000 tons of aluminum so that in 1941, when World War II came along, they used up that 42,000 supply and production increased by 600%. The workforce swelled to 12,000 to meet the needs for the construction of aircraft. During the slack times, workers were used to make city improvements. They built a park, they built a swimming pool. And one of the town officials said, "We were doing much more than building and operating a reduction plant. We were laying out a town, grading its streets, erecting its buildings, both public and private, and undertaking to supply all the modern services such as water, electricity, and sewage." The Alcoa Company began divesting after the World War II, and they began to sell their company housing to the employees. They donated plots of land for public facilities like libraries and schools. The transition extended into the early 1960s. So people continued to purchase company housing, etc., until that time. The town assumed responsibility for its water supply, which was a key aspect to the town's operations. That dam and that water supply were what drove the production. So the company still maintains a significant presence, and it still has a large impact on the local economy. And here we see the 1910 census for, I believe it's Calderwood. And we see the people working in the plants. Excuse me, this is 1920. Likewise, in 1930, they were doing sheet metal and aluminum plant work. And in 1940, you will notice that on this particular page, all of the employees are African American, working in the Alcoa. And we still find people in 1950 census working for the Aluminum Company of America. We find marriage records with a young lady who works for the company. We see death certificates where people worked for the Aluminum Company of America. He was a power plant employee for the Alcoa. We see World War II draftees. And this is a book that talks about the African American recruitment and the life that they lived in the company town of Alcoa. We also find workers' pictures on the job. We have to realize that there were approximately 2,000 industry-based company towns across America. The employers were looking for a dependable workforce. The employees were looking for stable housing, local schools, healthcare. They wanted to be able to walk to work, but they realized that they were being exploited and that there was corporate overreach, and they wanted that independence. So that led to the downfall of company towns. When we think about it, we overlook sometimes some of the company towns. Many of us are familiar with the plumbing products of Kohler, Wisconsin. It was originally a company town. Hershey, Pennsylvania, that makes chocolate, was a company town. So you can look through. Corning, New York, made glass. Your Corningware that were used in the 1950s and 60s originally was a company town. And we see other examples as well. So we will close with that today. I hope you will, if any of your relatives might have worked in a company town, that this might have enlightened you as to the structure of the town, the ability to organize a labor force, and the reason for their downfall and independence. And I will turn it back to Jessica.
Thank you, Terri. So interesting. I had no idea all those different industries had company towns. I'd kind of correlated it with mining mostly.
Well, and we have to also look in this area, concrete, those three towns, they all were company towns as well.
Very interesting. Well, thank you for joining us. You can always reach out to us at the Royal Gorge Regional Museum and History Center. We're located at 612 Royal Gorge Boulevard, or contact us or come to our website at canyoncity.gov/museum. See you next time.